School of Law, and Magdalit Masai, an independent researcher on Nile. Dr. Dereje is going to be an icebreaker. About 85% of the water source of Nile originates from Ethiopia. And this river stretches throughout 11 countries. Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia takes the major stake. Ethiopia is the source of the water, as it's all known. Egypt and Sudan got their own claim on the Nile River. What are those grounds to inquire such questions?
85+% of the flow comes from Ethiopia, but in terms of utilization, the Nile has been an exclusive monopoly of Egypt and Sudan. The issue of the Nile is far more important as between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, but the riparian countries are 11, like you said. That's so because it's an anomalous reality in the Nile, where the source of the waters, Ethiopia, which contributes 85% plus, makes absolutely no use, while the lower riparians, Egypt and Sudan, which make no contribution at all to the flow, are currently using the entirety of the flow, and they are hell-bent on making sure that this would remain forever. So that's why Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt are the main stakeholders in terms of utilization of the Nile water resources, but there are other 8 riparian countries who are entitled to and make a claim to the water resource as well.
Magdalene, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, as the doctor said, there are 11 countries which we need to consider, and this talking about the Nile use in terms of a subset of countries is actually a dangerous narrative, which is what got us here in the first place. As a transboundary water course, all the riparian countries have a fair and equitable share in the use of the water, and they're entitled to their fair share according to a reasonable and equitable utilization. That we don't have in the Nile Basin, and because of colonial era treaties which were made in the past, which basically allocated the whole of the Nile waters between these 2 countries. These countries, Egypt and Sudan in particular, seem to have historical claims and seem to have a larger stake in the water. But as far as being fair in international law and equitable transboundary use is concerned, all the 11 riparian countries have a fair share and an equal say as far as their claims in the Niles are concerned. So framing Nile water use in terms of a subset of countries is actually a very dangerous narrative, which we need to move away from. When we talk about the Nile, we have to talk in terms of the basin as a whole, including all the 11 countries. Because of the GERD, because of the dam that we're building, the conversation around the Nile is focusing on the 3 countries, because these 3 countries are actually the ones who are highly engaged in the discussion on the GERD. But as far as Nile water use is concerned, all 11 countries have equal stake and equal equitable share in the Nile water use.
Doctor, most of the time Egypt asserts a historical claim over the Nile River. Does that work out today?
Yeah. Just to add one important point of the danger of looking at the Nile through the prism of the GERD is a very dangerous approach. Because when we speak about the transboundary water courses and the right of riparian countries, we are speaking about legal rights to a basin. We are not speaking about one project, Project X, Project Y, Project Z. That's not the way. And not addressing the issue of water utilization in the perspective of a basin-wide approach, or at least a sub-basin approach, and reducing the whole process to a project-by-project deal is a recipe for disaster. That's one strategic mistake Ethiopia as a country made by engaging in a project-specific deal in the absence of an overarching legal institutional framework to address the issue of utilization and preservation of the resource. Coming back to the issue of historical rights, one thing that must be clear out from the outset is in international water law, there's no concept of historical rights. There's only a right to an equitable and reasonable utilization of a shared water resource by every riparian country, irrespective of your geographic position upstream, midstream, or downstream, or irrespective of any other extraneous considerations like contribution, dependence, length of use. All these are factors to be taken into account. They don't determine the right. The right is anchored in the fact of being a sovereign riparian country. So the implication is you cannot have any better right by exercising it for thousands of years, and not an iota of your rights would be reduced by not using it for thousands and thousands of years. So it's pegged with the fact of being a sovereign riparian country. Therefore, the claim to a historical right, sometimes they call it acquired rights. They give it different names, and it's all a pretext to justify, to legitimize an iniquitous reality where the country making most of the contributions makes no use of the water resource, and those downstream countries which make no contribution to the flow use the entirety. So it's throwing up different terms and phrases to justify and give a legitimate clock to an inequitable reality which cannot stand in the face of law. So like I said, the rule is equitable and reasonable utilization as a right to all riparian countries.
Magdalite,
Yes.
to add some, Egyptians most of the time stick to this colonial treaty, right? Because it favors their benefit. What are the major shortcomings of the colonial treaty?
Well, for starters, you can't have, as I said earlier, you can't have basin-wide allocation between two countries, where we have 11 countries to share the water with. So that's the first major drawback. It's not inclusive. It was done exclusively between Egypt and Sudan, if we're considering the 1959 agreement, and the UK and Egypt, if we're considering the 1929 agreement. So that in itself is a major drawback. It's not inclusive. Where we have 11 countries, these dealings were done between two countries. And the second one is, it is clearly unequitable and unfair. There is no arrangement where, if it was done right, that Egypt would get 66% of the Nile water, Sudan would get 22% of the Nile water, and all the other riparian countries would get 0% of the Nile water. So major drawbacks being one, it was uninclusive, and two, it's clearly unequitable. Under any set of circumstances, if we were to apply equitable and reasonable use in the Nile, and as Dr. mentioned earlier, there are factors to consider. So how much of your population depends on it, how much of the basin is in your country, how much of the water you contribute to existing and potential uses of your country, which is dependent on the Nile water. There are a set of factors which are outlined in the UN 1997 Shared Water Use Convention, and also in the Cooperative Framework Agreement. So there are factors which the international community agrees upon, which should be considered in determining equitable and reasonable use. If we were to apply those factors in the Nile Basin, there is no arrangement that would actually result in Egypt and Sudan using their current share, like their claimed share of the Nile waters, which is why they cling to it, because they know for a fact that no other arrangement will result in that kind of skewed sharing between shared use of the Nile waters. So the reason they cling to these colonial agreements is because it gives them an unfair advantage, an unfair use, an unfair claim on the Nile waters. But that's clearly, that's exactly the drawback of these agreements. They were not inclusive and they were not fair. So they don't stand in the face of international law, modern customary laws, and just basic rational, decent allocation. None of it makes sense. None of it makes sense. So yeah, the major drawbacks being these two was...
Doctor, do you have any?
Yeah, the discussion about colonial treaties and their relevance is one murky area where there is so much misunderstanding. When we speak about colonial treaties in the context of the Nile waters, we are primarily referring to the 1929 agreement. It was an agreement entered into between Britain, representing its colonies, and Egypt. So one thing that must be clear is that if there is ever any relevance of that treaty in the sense of its continued application, that absolutely doesn't concern Ethiopia. We never were British colonies, so it's a non-issue for us. So Ethiopia has nothing to do with the 1929 Nile Agreement. But even then, for the former British colonies, is there any legal possibility whereby the extremely inequitable provisions of the 1929 agreement would still be binding on the independent Nile riparian countries? That's a clear issue of law, and international law is very clear on this. Upon their independence, countries decide which of their past treaties concluded on their behalf by the predecessor state they want to be bound by. And none of the former British colonies accepted the 1929. Not even Sudan itself accepted it. It challenged the 1929. So there is no, well, the narrative is made to give the impression that the existing inequitable allocation reality in the Nile Basin is somehow founded on some form of law, and there is absolutely no legal foundation for the reality. The second treaty is the 1959 treaty. So what they did is divided the entire flow between Egypt and Sudan. In the 1929 agreement, the utilizable volume was 52 billion, 48 was determined to be Egypt's share, and 4 billion cubic meter was determined to be Sudan's share. They call it their historical right. It's not a legal concept, but it's a reference to indicate how this calculation of share was reached at. And the calculation was based on the assumption that they are entitled to what they have been practically using until the date of the treaty. Okay, so how much you have been using, that is considered to be historically your share. It doesn't have any legal significance. It doesn't extend to the rights of other riparian countries. So then the second agreement between, it's not a colonial treaty, it's the first Nile Basin treaty between two independent riparian countries, the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement. What was left undivided and unutilized of the entire flow of the Nile was to be entirely allocated and used. That's evident in the designation of the treaty itself, 1959 treaty, for the full utilization. So the entirety of the flow is now allocated between Egypt and Sudan. 84 billion cubic meters is said to be the annual flow. 55.5 billion is for Egypt, 18.5 billion cubic meter is for Sudan, and 10 billion cubic meter annually is lost to evaporation and seepage. Zero, not even a drop left for the other riparian countries. So this is a reality. And the 1929 treaty has no relevance, leave alone Ethiopia, even to the former British colonies. The 1959 agreement is done between two parties, Egypt and Sudan. It's a typical bilateral treaty which has absolutely no legal significance for any other but Egypt and Sudan. So the reality in the Nile Basin stands in the air. There's no legal foundation for it. Okay.
Good. Magdalite, Egypt has been and still been pretty active on narratives. When we see Ethiopia, even we are too late to construct a dam. Egypt constructed the first dam on Nile in 1902, right?
I think it has to do with our attachment, with how we frame our attachment with the Nile. So growing up, we hear songs and folklores about how the Nile is the grace of the country, the beauty of the country, how the Nile is a river that flows from heaven, and how the Nile has not been useful for Ethiopia, but actually loots the country to serve others. So this is the narrative that we grew up hearing, and it comes from us not utilizing the waters kilometers away. So this physical detachment from the water actually contributes to the narrative, I think. So because of historical circumstances, because of economic circumstances, political circumstances, we have not been able to use the water. So our framing of the Nile, our narrative, our thinking of the Nile stayed at that level, where we think about the Nile as the grace, the beauty of the country, and as a resource which we haven't used so far. But when we come to Egypt and Sudan, the water crosses their main cities. They see it day in, day out. They have been using it for centuries, for millennia. They built civilizations on it, so they have this really close attachment to it. And because of that, they, as you said, they're pretty active in making sure that every citizen, from the young to the old, know the value of the water, what the Nile means to these countries, and what it means to them individually. That has not been the case here as in Ethiopia. This has clearly started to change after the initiation of the GERD. There is more attachment, there is more national sentiment towards the water, towards Abai, towards the Nile. There's also this renewed sense of, okay, we need to reclaim our waters, our soil, our silt, our land, all of that. But circumstances have led us not to feel intrinsically attached or existentially attached to the Nile. But if we look at realities, the Nile or Abai is as existential to us as it is for them. If we look at the numbers, Abai, the water resource in Abai Basin, and I say Abai, not to say the Nile, because the Nile, so around more than 70% of the water resources of the country is in that basin, is in the Abai Basin in Ethiopia. Around 90% of the country, people who live in the 6 out of the 9 regions, directly or indirectly, are related to the water use in the Nile. More than 50 million people directly live in the basin. Around 2/3 of our irrigation potential, our total irrigation potential, lies in the Nile Basin. More than 2/3 of our hydropower potential lies in the Nile Basin. So when you think about these things, the Nile is existential to us. We can't hope to reach these goals, these aspirations we have as a country without utilizing the water. So it is not a matter of development or a matter of choice. It's a matter of existence. We can't move forward as a country without using this water. That's why we say it's existential to us. We just haven't realized it because we haven't been formulating the discussions around the Nile this way. It's only after the GERD that we're even seeing this renewed national interest in the water. So a lot has to be done in terms of shaping the narrative. We can learn a lot from Egyptians and Sudanese. In terms of making sure that the Nile and Abai is known for its relevance to the country at the level of every citizen.
Doctor.
Maybe a few points on why we are late, quote unquote. I think one has to take into account the universal experience. It's common to observe in major international basins that it's countries in the towards the lower end of the resources that have thousands and thousands of years of experience in terms of harnessing and putting the resources to use. You have to also take into consideration the climatic conditions of the riparian countries, and as they say, Egypt is a gift of the Nile. They depend on the Nile. Their civilization is rooted in the Nile, and the Nile is a mild, it's a ferocious beast upstream, and then it's a mild servant downstream. So many things have made it easy for them to make use of it, but most importantly, the pattern of the utilization and the pattern of future legal cooperative patterns in the basin were decisively determined by the British colonial presence in the basin. So we have a historical baggage to deal with, to reverse. And for quite some time we have been relatively a humid country. We didn't need to depend on the Nile as much as we do now, and inevitably more in the future. As far as understanding of the significance of the Nile for the country is concerned, in fairness, the Emperor Haile Selassie was very keen on making sure that the resources put to use to change the fate of the nation. And actually, Ethiopia, under the emperor, invested a huge sum of money to carry out study and investigation. All the significant study in the basin was carried out by a project sponsored by the emperor, dating back to the 1960s. So there was an awareness and a consciousness on the part of the political leaders, the emperor and the military government So, the problem is we were not in a position to make significant and meaningful use of the resource for many reasons. Primarily, lack of internal stability. We had been, deeply in crisis. So you need time to sit and reflect and then garner the necessary resources to utilize your natural resource. We're busy in conflict, and so we didn't have time. So it's the relative peace we had after the change of government after 1991 that created the opportunity. But the awareness and the effort has always been there across successive regimes, irrespective of their ideological differences.
Okay. Before a couple of months, President of Egypt, speaking at the UN General Assembly, has said Ethiopia shouldn't impose a de facto situation on the Nile without any agreement. What does it mean by a de facto in that sense?
Yeah, in a way, Sisi was telling the international community that developments in Ethiopia require the consent and blessing of Egypt. Definitely. If you just decipher it, that's the essence of,
he appreciated that.
His message. The question is there any legal basis to claim such a veto power over developments upstream? Yes, probably he has the hangover of the 1929 treaty. Under the 1929 agreement, Egypt was given a veto power. Any development upstream requires the consent of Egypt. We are in the 21st century. So, I mean, there's no reason a source country would require the blessing and agreement of a downstream riparian to develop its water resources. In a way, Sisi is imputing to Ethiopia what Egypt actually is doing, and what they are doing is to make the utilization of the Nile water resources upstream a done deal. The most you can do is generate power with our permission, because they claim to the entire flow as belonging to them. So who is I mean he's attributing to Ethiopia what he's really pursuing. So that's absolutely a baseless claim, and that's an outrageous claim to make on a celebrated platform like the platform of the General Assembly, where the founding principles of the organization are sovereign equality of countries. Yeah.
Okay. To Magdalawit, on the same podium during the UN General Assembly, Ethiopian President Sahle-Work Zewde, for her part, said the use of the river should be decided according to the international law, fair and equitable use of natural resource. What does it mean by fair and equitable in this context?
Well, what the President highlighted was what is actually enforced now as far as transboundary water use is concerned. So there has been very narrow and short-sighted principles and doctrines in the past, which some favored upstream countries, some favored downstream countries, some favored first users of the water. So they have faded in the past because they were not rooted in this principle of cooperation, equitable and reasonable use, and causing no significant harm. These three are the pillars of transboundary water use currently, and that's in that statement that the President made. She was highlighting that, which is actually the current state of things in the world. What the Egyptians and Sudanese, to some extent, and also what you see in President Sisi's statement, is this residual sentiment from precedents that has been set in the past, residual sentiments from these agreements, which actually are not based on equitable and reasonable use. So when it comes down to what it means equitable and reasonable use without causing significant harm in the basin, as we mentioned earlier, the UN 1997 Convention has stipulated these factors, outlined these factors that we need to consider in determining equitable and reasonable use. They include the amount of population dependent on the water, how much of the water you contribute, how much of the basin is in your country, your social and economic needs, your present and potential future uses. If it would cause, like if one use by a country would cause significant harm on the others. There are a set of factors. These factors need to be translated to numbers in order to determine equitable and reasonable use, and we see that gap there now. The law stops at highlighting these factors, what these factors should be, and recommends that countries and cooperation consider all of these factors, give them weights, and then come to an arrangement, come to an agreement on how to divide the waters based on this based on these stated factors. So that is the foundation and what it means to share the water in an equitable and reasonable use.